Joshua Banbury is a genius vocal artist and emerging operatic librettist. He has shaped and refined his voice to be expressive of his life and his story. He is very much inspired by his Texas roots and understands that his act of singing gives voice to his many ancestors who were not allowed to be heard. There are many complexities within Joshua that come through in our conversation. Issues of race, sexuality, and who gets to decide what is relevant to be heard on the stage are swirling universes beneath our conversation. Through it all, he reminds us, I am different for a reason, because I've been sent here to do different things. My path is different. Hello, and welcome to another installment of At the Podium with me, Patrick Huey. At the Podium is a platform where we will learn from people who come from different walks of life, careers, and experiences, but all share one thing in common. They have stepped fully into the transformative power of saying yes to the unexpected turns of their lives, and they are now using the power of their voice, or podium, to make an impact on the world we live in today. At the Podium is the intersection of art, culture, and big thoughts wrapped up in good, old-fashioned conversation. Today, I'm thrilled and humbled to share the podium with musician, librettist, and singer Joshua Banbury. Joshua Banbury is a 26-year-old Texas-born vocalist and librettist, gaining international acclaim for his work in opera, folk music, and jazz. He is currently a librettist in residence at the American Lyric Theater in New York City and in residence at Soho House, Austin, with his jazz trio. Joshua's works have been presented by and at Lincoln Center, the American Lyric Theater, Washington National Opera, the Kennedy Center, and National Sawdust. In 2022, the Washington National Opera and the Kennedy Center will premiere his original opera, The Burning Bush, written in collaboration with Jasmine Barnes and the National Symphony Orchestra. Joshua has recently received writing and performance commissions from the New York Philharmonic, the National Black Theater, the New School, and the Coalition for African Americans in the Performing Arts. He has been engaged as a soloist in performances at and with the New York Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Glimmerglass Opera, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, and the Kennedy Center. Joshua is a proud graduate of the New School and the Austin School for Performing and Visual Arts. Before we hear from Joshua, I want to invite you to share At the Podium with people in your lives. If you love what you hear from him today, and I know you will, take a screenshot and share on your Instagram and tag @thepodium_Patrick Huey. Or if you're on Facebook, share our link there. Your shares, likes, and 5-star written reviews help grow our audience and move us up the charts. I am grateful for your help in this capacity. So Joshua, welcome to At the Podium.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for making time today. I know you're quite busy writing your own work, performing. So I know the energy and focus that takes to do that. So thank you for making time for this today.
I appreciate you for making time for me as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. I came across your music on Instagram and I was intrigued by your voice and your stage presence and the breadth of work that you are creating. I really was captured by your video of Billy Strayhorn's Lush Life, which you recorded 3 years ago. You were with the pianist Rasan Hakim and the cellist Mel Greenwich.
Yes. Yeah.
Your interpretation was stunning. It was haunting, completely dropped in. I want to know what drew you to that song and that arrangement in particular.
Thanks, first of all, for noticing that. I had just moved to New York when I recorded that video in 2018, and I left Baltimore to finish my studies in New York at the New School. I went to New York with the intention of trying to figure out how to be a jazz singer. I made that video within a week of me moving there. We recorded that in Brooklyn. And Rassam was really kind to me. Like he brought in a few different musicians for us to work with. And that was the first project that we did. I also chose it just because Billy Strayhorn is like an idol of mine. And I really try my best to share his work. And I just hate how, I don't know if you know anything about his story, obviously, probably. But, you know, he was overlooked during his time. So that was my initial reason for choosing the song. And secondly, I was going through like a difficult separation at the time. So that song is like quintessential. Yeah. It's definitely like all of the feelings that you go through when you're like separating or dealing with the loss of someone that used to be like very close to you.
I play it on the soprano saxophone, and it's a really difficult song to play because it really is two stories combined into one. And you have to really invest in the emotional journey of that song to make the music work because it's so complex. Rhythmically, tonally, the tone of the song is incredibly complex. And so it's
like two different songs.
It's two different songs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you describing Strayhorn as being overlooked is appropriate to and personified in that song.
Yes. And I think it's even more interesting that like he wrote that at 18 or 19. He hadn't even really seen the world at that point. I wonder if he had even fallen in love and had the chance to be someone who had visited gay places and is now, you know, sitting alone at a bar. I'm like, how does a teenager talk about chapters in our lives that usually happen later on in our lives? There's so much maturity in the writing. It's impressive to me.
It's a song that resonates because every singer worth their salt tries to sing that song. Nancy Wilson had a great rendition of that song. I was just struck that you were singing it and the way that you were singing it. I think one thing that drew me to the song, Joshua, was the tone, the quality, the timbre of your voice. The first thing I was curious about is the sound that you make. That sound, that is your voice. That is so distinctly your voice. Is that you, or was that something you learned to manufacture? Because it's an unusual, emotionally evocative voice.
Thank you. I think the foundation of my timbre or my technique is like classical singing. So I think I start from there with making sure that like my vowels are even open and round and tall, which can really change the way that your singing comes across. I'm really interested in like vowels and diction. It can do a lot with like even placing you in a certain time period. I started with classical singing and like singing art songs and then transitioning into jazz and listening to people like Johnny Hartman, listening to singers like Herb Jeffries, of course, Billy Eckstine. When I first heard Billy singing, and apparently he taught Sarah Vaughan a lot of what she knows about singing. When she was a teenager, he hired her to sing in his big band. His approach to singing is just so clean, and it sounded like almost theatrical, but his phrasing was also like very hip and swinging. But it was full singing as well. He wasn't singing off the breath in a way that Billie Holiday does.
Right.
Billy like hardly sings, but Billy Eckstine really sings like on the voice, and it's really supported all the way through. So I got really excited when I first started exploring his music because I realized that it was possible to take this really enormous sound that I learned to make, but just, you know, I'm learning to sing in a large acoustic space and bringing that to jazz. I didn't know if it was possible, but I'm studying him, and like later on I studied Johnny. He was very known for easy singing, very, very light. And as I've gotten older in the past like year and a half, I've taken more inspiration from his singing, because that's, I think, the thing that I'm most self-conscious about is I really want to approach the form with the respect that it deserves in terms of like honoring the people who have contributed to the form. So I don't want to sing a jazz standard the way an opera singer would, just kind of like billowing through it the whole time. And so I think that's kind of how I've gotten over time the sound, if that makes any sense. Kind of just slowly chiseling each world until they like come into one.
It does make sense. And when you reference Johnny Hartman, I can hear that in your voice. And I think your voice sits in the same range as Johnny Hartman, which I think he had a very unusual range of voice, because so often musically people tend to be attuned to the tenor voice in men, and we sort of highlight that. But when you really get those rich baritones and bass voices, and I know those terms are quite fluid for singers, but when you sing, I hear echoes of Johnny Hartman in your voice.
Thank you. That reminds me, I actually have one more, and I always forget to say this as a reference, but around the time that I moved to New York, I started studying Carnatic singing, or Hindustani singing, and not in any serious way. I'm still most certainly a novice, but I started working with a singer based in Brooklyn. Her name is Rumpa Mahadevan, and she's a Carnatic singer. She's leading sort of like a renaissance, a Carnatic renaissance right now in New York City. She taught me to sing through some of the basic ragas, and I use a lot of techniques in Indian. I try to use a lot of techniques in Indian singing, like gamakas. The idea that there's always a note between each note, and like really thinking very intently about how you move between them. Indian singers focus a lot on little details like that, which has really opened my ear and also given me that ease of singing that I'm looking for, and not being so shouty, opera-y.
It's not where a lot of singers are right now. A lot of singers, when they sing, are working with a lot of tension in the throat. They're belting very high, probably too high for what's proper for their vocal care. And they're creating a dramatic effect, no doubt.
Yes.
But I hear when you sing that you're keeping the track aligned, that you are breathing properly, that you're singing properly. Your reference to the creation of the vowel sound really helps carry the emotion of the song through. And maybe that's what you're doing, and that's so interesting, is that the emotion is not the pyrotechnics of the voice. It's the meaning behind the words. It's the intention of the song that is really impacting the listener.
Definitely. It's the way that you say the words, even that can, even a thing like the fact that I'm from Texas changes the sound of my music severely. And I try not to, but I mean, that's something I have to be aware of. But that adds a completely different element to the message.
You refer to yourself as a classically trained singer, but you don't refer to yourself as an opera singer. Why is that distinction important for you?
It's important because, one, I really like the term vocal artist, because I really think it's an accurate description of the work that I'm trying to do. I'm really fascinated with just so many ways that I can communicate through just my voice alone, just across cultures, across decades there's just so many different ways to sing. I'll say it in a more simple way. And I've always been really fascinated by that. And so I'm always approaching it like from the art of singing. I think saying that I'm an opera singer is just so limiting, even just mostly for myself, and even from a marketing standpoint. If I say that I'm that, it makes it difficult for me to even think about working with other artists or whatever. It puts me in a box.
Did you face what types of challenges did you face that you feel are unique to your experience as a Black classically trained opera singer?
Well, I think the first one is that I'm from Austin, which is, most people know, pretty it's not a lot of Black people here, I'll say that. So when I was studying opera, first started as a teenager, I was under the assumption that there were no Black classical singers. My collegiate path took me to 2 HBCUs where my entire world was just like turned upside down. And I met hundreds of Black opera singers. I think the thing is that there really are quite a few Black opera singers, and there's quite a few really excellent ones as well. And what I noticed was when I started doing semi-professional work towards the end of my degree, doing like summer programs for opera, I noticed that my friends that I just thought were so brilliant and that I thought were really pushing forward like the form, and they were not getting the opportunities to really showcase their brilliance and showcase all of the years of work that they put into all the nuances that go into being a classical singer. They were mostly subjected to doing like some sort of minstrelsy on stage. So I find that like the opportunities for Black opera singers, Black classical singers are limited, but that it really is only because of the repertoire. And of course, because, racism, But, that's also because of that. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that's why I started writing libretto.
That was the impetus for you to start writing your own pieces.
Yes. I've been writing since I was in sixth grade. Well, much earlier than that. I had my first play done like in sixth grade and we were living in Atlanta. But I put that aside when I discovered I could sing when I was maybe 14 or 15. And I didn't touch it until I had that experience singing professionally. And I was like, maybe it's time I see if I can revive this gift and use it to help in any way that I can.
On the theater television side, people often pen work for themselves because particularly people who don't feel that the establishment represents them as an artist. It's not unusual. And there are many people who have been able to successfully transition from performer to writer. You don't hear of that so often in the music world, particularly in classical music, because it's so defined by a very specific canon. But it's very interesting to see you trailblazing in that particular realm.
Oh, thank you. What I think has been interesting so far in the journey has been because I've been a professional librettist since I got into this residency earlier this fall. So it's been maybe six months. It has been interesting being a writer and a singer at the same time now. They really inform each other so well. When I'm trying to work on jazz standards, it helps a lot with thinking like a librettist and vice versa.
You've said previously in other interviews that you've done that folk music moves you in a very specific way. Again, you are not being pigeonholed into one specific genre of music. So I'm curious as to what folk music does to you and for you and why it resonates so much for you.
I found out last year that I'm a fifth or sixth generation Texan, that my family has been here in Texas before the Civil War. That's one of the main reasons why I started being curious about my past and curious about my ancestors and the lives that they lived and the music that they sang and, the things that they had to figure out and all of that. I felt like I also was at a point where when I first started digging into folk music, it was maybe 4 years ago now. I was living in Baltimore. I was, the program I was in was really, they weren't very encouraging of me trying repertoire that wasn't, German lieder, Italian art song, whatever. And I remember I had an argument with a teacher of mine where they basically said that folk singing is not high art. You can't sing something like that at a recital or whatever. But I think that's so silly. And that was another reason why I sort of started turning away from classical music, because I see there's so much virtuosity, obviously, in folk music, folk singing. And singing a cappella, even something as simple as that, is not as hard as it seems. But I'm also really drawn to folk music because of it's very narrative-led. The narrative is like primary in most folk songs, and that is what fascinates me. Within a little 2-minute folk song, you can have a beginning, middle, end story about a character, where they went, who they were, where they lived. And I think that's just so cool. And it's just a sign of like the times where people had to learn how to entertain themselves without technology. They were just sitting on the porch, hanging out with your family. You got to figure out, like, what are you going to do? I guess make up songs and tell stories that are captivating to you and your family. And so I started collecting folk songs, starting with the Ritchie family in Kentucky. Jean Ritchie plays a dulcimer. She comes from a long heritage of Appalachian dulcimer players in Kentucky. That's where I got the majority of my repertoire for a folk EP that I recorded earlier this year. But in the other half of it was going back and looking at what sort of songs enslaved people were singing in Texas in the 19th century as well. I realized I didn't realize why I was doing it while I was doing it. I had an idea, but I wasn't entirely sure. But after the project was finished, I was certain that I felt like it was something I needed to do to pay tribute to ancestors of mine that maybe had the gift of song, that never had the opportunity to use it, but their voices weren't heard. The songs that they wrote weren't heard. That was a big epiphany that I had at the end. And that's why I'll continue to keep looking into folk music, especially regionally here in this area.
Your palette is so broad, but between folk, jazz, and opera, where do you draw your inspiration?
A few different places. I'm generally led to one. I'm inspired by anything that helps me to tell my own story, which is the main purpose of most of my art. Simply to document my life story, first and foremost. And understanding that there is beauty in art in just telling my story as it was. I'm also really inspired by visual art, surrealism, Leonora Carrington. I look at a lot of her paintings. And the surrealism movement is sort of how I try to approach my writing and my singing in terms of that sort of abstraction. And I think my initial source of being a creative, where that came from, was growing up in a very small town here in Texas and really not having many outlets to express my creativity or be amongst other creatives. So I became very good at doing that in my mind. My imagination grew very big, I think, growing up in rural Texas. So that inspires me a lot as well. And I've been back here in Texas for the past few months, and it really does inspire me when I'm here, just the space alone.
I was in Mexico City not too long before the pandemic shut us down, and they were doing a retrospective of Leonora Carrington's work at the,
oh my goodness,
in Mexico City at the Fine Arts Museum there. And
how was it?
It was spectacular. She leaps off the canvas.
Yes.
And she
haunts you.
Haunts you. I mean, as your voice is haunting, her work is haunting, but her use of color, her use of texture, is evocative as well, I thought, when I saw her work in Mexico City. And it was the first time I had been exposed to her work.
Yes. And she was such a scholar, too. That's what I found after digging more into her research. Her work is full of symbolism that can only be acquired by researching what symbols belong to different cultures and different time periods and eras and all that. That's what I try to do with my work. I'm really inspired by history as well. That's where I draw a lot of ancient cultures and things like that for my writing, especially.
We've talked about your present life and the work that you're doing and beginning to do. But I want to know, where did this gift come from? Did you know that you had this gift when you were growing up, and who nurtured the gift within you of singing and creation?
I didn't realize I could be good at singing until I was about 15, but I was always a performer from the age of 4 or 5. I will say my parents have encouraged me from the very beginning. Yeah, and my father really, he really went out of his way to support me when I was in high school doing competitions. And I left the public school that I was attending to go to a new private school that opened up here in Austin, the Austin School for Performing and Visual Arts. And I went there and I was able to get voice lessons almost every day for over a year. And that really set such a strong foundation for me as a singer. I think it was 17 to 18. I've been very fortunate to be around people who saw me and also saw the potential in me as well. I have a very close-knit, supportive family.
I want to know what music gives you. When you sing, when you're writing, when you're creating, what are you getting from that?
I'm getting an atmosphere of my own to dwell in that I invite other people to dwell in as well, almost as a root of escapism, if that makes sense. That's a lot of the premise for my art. I really am fascinated with the idea of being able to create entire ecosystems just within my mind. And I think music is the best way to do that in terms of creating a space for people to dwell in. I think that's really powerful.
Do you think that music can heal and bring people together if they can dwell in that space?
Yes, I know for sure that it can do that. But I also know that music can really be a way to just transport us beyond like anything that like human beings can like really put words to. Music is one of the only ways that I know how to just go beyond myself.
It's interesting you say that. When I was studying to be an actor and we would approach a musical, we would always say that the reason people sing is because they have an experience, they're having an experience that cannot be expressed fully in regular dialogue. And that's when you elevate the emotion, you elevate the expression through song.
That's exactly it. I think that's spot on.
Are your parents musical as well?
They have great musical taste. My mom introduced me to jazz. They also have pretty eclectic taste, I will say. But they're not musicians formally. As far as I know, I'm the only musician in my family on both sides.
It's unusual, though. You talk about so many narratives that we hear about musicians and actors and dancers. You hear the narrative sometimes that the parents are not supportive of that. And part of the journey to becoming an artist is how do you pursue those dreams, those ambitions without formal support from your family. You seem to have the fortune of having parents who may not be natural musicians, but who have understood and nurtured that within you.
It is difficult because my parents and I are both learning, like, what does it mean to have a son that's in show business and like his life is like kind of a mess, like 80% of the year. But like we're both learning, but I will say, they've always supported me in many ways, like financially or just like being there for me physically. I'm very, very lucky.
Does the success that you're having and the interest that you're having with such marquee venues like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, like the American Lyric Theater, like the Kennedy Center, does that help bolster their support? Because they see that people at very high levels are responding to the work that you're doing. Yeah.
I mean, that's how it goes, I think, with most parents. I think it comes out of fear for them because they just really want me to be able to sustain myself and be all right without them. And I think once these gigs like at that levels started coming in, I think they're increasingly less worried about me. I think that's really what it is. Even for myself, it does make me feel that I'm getting closer to security as an artist, which sounds like an oxymoron, like putting the two words together, but as close as one can get.
Have you ever doubted your talent?
Yes. I probably do it more than I should. Yeah, and a lot of that has just come from I've bounced around so much within different mediums, and one day I'm a singer and next day I'm a writer, and then I'm singing jazz and I'm doing opera, now I'm doing folk. It's really played into a lot of imposter syndrome that I struggle with sometimes. But on a good day, I remind myself that they're all connected and they're all really the same thing.
What connects them? What connects the writing, the folk, the jazz, the opera?
Self-expression. That makes sense.
And what do you want to express? What do you want us as a listener to know about you, Joshua, the creator?
That I lived, that I was here, first of all. I think because I study a lot of ancient culture, I'm really so fascinated with the idea of like the Egyptian civilization lasted almost 4,000 years. The United States hasn't even been around 400 or 500. And just thinking about maybe 2,000 years into the Egyptian dynasty, I'm sure none of them ever thought that in another 2,000 years, Egypt would be no more, and that the world will continue spinning for tens and thousands of more years. And I'm so grateful that they, for whatever reason, had a culture of writing things, of transcription and writing things down. And I think that's so powerful. I really am motivated because I think when I started trying to figure out who I was as an adult and an artist, there were not a lot of places that I could go to find inspiration for stories like mine, who led lives like me. And it felt when I was younger at the time that there just wasn't another person like me who lived before. And, but that's just simply not true. It's just about whose stories have been magnified and what stories have been put in front of me. And so I hope with my work to simply leave a legacy behind for people to use as either, a source of entertainment or a reference point for what it meant to be someone who lived in 2021 and was from a very small Texas town with a Confederate monument in it, who worked themselves all the way to, singing at opera houses. I know a story like that matters, as everyone's story matters. That's why I really like singing and writing, because I just feel like it's the perfect vehicle for me to share my story.
You have talked about in the past, in other interviews that I listened to, that you have challenges around depression.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that music helps that for you? Or is the music a result of that?
Yeah, sometimes it's a result, especially in the past 2 years, during the pandemic. Singing is pretty complicated for me, my relationship with singing. I don't do it as often as people probably think. I get a lot of anxiety performing, and that's always kind of hindered me from doing more things live. But I'm getting more comfortable with myself and my body now, thankfully. But I think the depression comes from a lot of things that I'm always trying to balance with my mental health. And just also like some of the struggles that I deal with, like in terms of where I come from and being always feeling like very singular, and no matter like what space I'm in. That's kind of been a recurring theme as far as I can remember in my life. So solitude as well is something that like I'm always trying to figure out how to be content with. It's pretty beneficial for my work, but being 25, 26, being alone also is not, I don't know. I feel like I shouldn't be as alone as I am, but a lot of that has to do with the pandemic. I will say I wasn't as depressed as I was before the pandemic started. A lot of the depressive episodes or whatnot started settling in more in 2020.
Do you think that perhaps that feeling, you said earlier that Strayhorn felt overlooked, perhaps isolated, do you think that's why you responded to the Lush Life songs? It's very reflective of where you might be in your own personal journey around your work, your mental health, etc.
Yeah. Yes. Most certainly. And even my own journey in like being a gay man who dates other gay men, like that has been quite a journey.
How so?
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, not a lot, but everything you teach yourself for the most part. And when you come from a place like where I come from, it's really the adults that I knew, it felt like they were almost too ashamed to tell me how do you go on a date, or how do I shave? Or it's like when they find out you're gay down here, at least 10, 15 years ago, like people just gave up on you. Or yeah, of course, they bullied you, whatever. And then they kind of just gave up on you. So I just found myself having to, like many gay men of color have to do, just sort of reacquainting themselves with the world. There were a lot of hurdles that I had to overcome to get more familiar with like, what does it mean to be in love and show that in a healthy way. And often feels like a foreign concept to me.
The idea of showing love healthily, or?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Of course, I know what it is, but I just know that like in my upbringing, like I didn't have a lot of genuine acceptance, which I think is true, is real love. So that's things like that really play into like how I feel each day. And if I'm feeling that way, for example, if things like that are like swirling in my head for a particular day, I don't want to sing some little standard or something from our real book. I'm not in the mood. And typically I'll go and write. That's something that I've had to, I'm still trying to figure out. My question for my teacher was, is singing for me or is it for them? And I've always been told it's for them. And sometimes I'm just like, but why? Like, why can't it also be for myself? I really need it for myself. I think both is the good answer, but it's always just been when you're on stage, it's for them. Focus on it, giving to the people. But what about what music and performing music can do for yourself?
It must do something for you. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. Even if it is, as you said earlier, creating your legacy, creating your thumbprint in this world that you were here.
And thankfully, it's been much easier to do that as years have gone on, like in terms of like society is much more accepting of a lot of the things I struggled with even 13 years ago. Well, not even 10 years ago, to be honest. But yeah.
Are you comfortable with the term iconoclast?
I like the word. I think it's an interesting concept. In terms of, it comes from, of course, the word iconic. I mean, that's where the word iconic comes from. I think, are you asking me if that's what I think I am?
I'm asking you, I could imagine you being described in that way. From the breadth of the work that you do, you have created a space for yourself that is not easily definable or easily categorized.
Yes.
So the word iconoclast came to mind.
And remind me what the official definition of that is. Would you mind?
Let's pull it up.
Let's pull it up.
A person who attacks cherished beliefs or institutions, a destroyer of images used in religious worship.
That's me. Destroyer of images that's me.
But I think in terms of that, it's really a person who breaks molds, a person who is not easily defined by a specific category, but can exist in many different that's lanes.
Me. I mean, I'm the first Black person to graduate from the Performing Arts High School here in Austin. As far as I know, one of the only young Black opera singers to come out of this city. I'm also the youngest librettist in the residency that I'm in. I've always had to just sort of create my own space. And I've always felt like I've just been sort of dropped in a place where I didn't belong. And therefore I had to create my own space within that space. And I resented my parents, of course, for that, still do every now and then. But I really do also thank them because it really made me have to think in a really dissimilar way in terms of how to become myself.
What part of your life at this point requires you to take the biggest leap of faith?
I think I'm doing it now. I'm working full time as an artist now. And it continues to be a huge leap of faith. I will say I'm grateful that I can work for the most part full time, but it is very scary, especially with this time. But I think I made that decision because I didn't want my art to suffer because I may be spread too thin with other responsibilities. And so I knew I would have to probably live more humbly so that I can really put most of my energy into making sure that I can sing and make art at a level that doesn't require as much energy. If you're improvising and playing jazz, if you have done it so often, you don't even have to think about the changes or, it just comes out of you naturally. That's the level of art making that I want to get to, where it's beyond work. It's just an extension of who I am.
You said that around the age of 13 or 14, early teens is when you really stepped into understanding of your musicality. And it was nurtured specifically starting around that point. What would you now, looking back, say to that person back then as they were starting out?
Take piano lessons. Don't stop. And I would probably just encourage him and say that I'm different for a reason because I've been sent here to do different things. My path is different. I've always sort of been just immersed in my own world. And I would really just encourage myself to go even further with that so that by the time I'm an adult, all of those, that's just, my imagination is just so developed and full.
Go further. That's a great lesson for all of us. Joshua, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it. I appreciate your honesty and your willingness just to share your heart with us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you being so intentional with these questions and being so curious as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and to those of you who are watching and listening, remember, we all have a voice, so use yours wisely.